We continue now at the top of Daf and Beis and Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 105b. On the previous summer, the Gemara said, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught, Alu Ba'ilan, if they ascend a tree, this is talking about a zav and a person that is tahar, Shekocha Ra, that has weak strength, Uvesocha, or a branch, Shekocha Ra, that also is weak in strength. So then Tameh, the person that is pure, is now going to become Tameh. And Rashi explains, Alu Zav Vitar Le'ilan Shekocha Ra. Again, the zav and the pure person, they ascend a tree which is weak, or the socha anaf ilan, or a socha which is the branch of a tree, shekocha ra, which is weak. Tameh hatar, so the person who's pure now becomes tameh. Shekevan sha ilan o asocha kocha ra, since the tree or the branch is weak, nechfefes tachtein, so then it's going to bend underneath their weight. V'chavida elyon ala tachton, whatever's on top is going to be heavy upon whatever's on bottom. V'nishan all of it's going to rest upon him. Mikocho shel elyon, from the strength of whatever's on top. Uvein zav shenishan al atar, and whether a zav is leaning upon a pure person, uvein tar shenishan al zav, or whether the pure person is leaning upon the zav, tameh is going to be tameh in this case, because essentially it's going to be a situation where the person was moved by the zav, which creates the tumah. And the Gemara continues, Hey chidami ilan shekocho ra. What does it mean that the ilan is weak? How do you know that a tree is considered weak? Amri devei Rabbi Yanai, they said in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yanai, Kol she'ein bi karo lochuk rova. If you're not able to carve out a quarter of a kav from the trunk, that is a weak tree. Heichi dami socha shekocha ra. What's considered to be a branch which is weak? Amar Reish Lakish says, Kol shenechbes bechezyon. If it's so thin that it can be hidden within a person's fist, that is considered to be a weak branch. And the Gemara continues, Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah over there, this is a Mishnah in Meseches Olos, Hamahalich bebeis hapras, if somebody is walking in a beis hapras, which is an area where there might be a kever, there might be a dead corpse, al gabe avonim sheyachol lahasit, if he's walking on stones which he's able to move as he's walking, or al ha'adam v'al ha'behema shekochan ra, or if he's riding upon a person or an animal that is weak, so then tameh, then he's going to be tameh. And the Gemara says, Hey chidami adam shekocho ra. What does it mean, a person that's weak? Amar Reish Lakish says, Kol sherochvo v'arkavos of nokshos, anybody who when you ride upon the person, his knees bang together because it's hard for him to hold the person up. And Hey chidami behema shekocha ra, what's considered an animal that is weak? Amri devei Rabbi Yanai, they say in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yanai, Kol sherochva, any animal which if you ride it, matila glolim, it releases excrement due to the strain on its body, that's considered to be a weak animal. And Rashi explains, Hamahalich bebeis hapras, the person's walking in the beis hapras. A beis hapras is soda shenechrash bo kever. It's a field, and they plowed the field, and they plowed up a kever. They plowed up a grave site. So chashu le'etzam kisora, we're concerned that there might be a bone the size of a piece of barley. Shemitami b'mago v'masa, that can create tumah if the person touches it or if the person carries it. Ve'enu mitami ba'oel, but it cannot create tumah soel. Just walking over it, just creating an oel over it is not going to create any tumah underneath the oel. V'hayu sham now there are some stones in this field that are not set, they're not fixed in the earth. So they move because of the person walking over them. So what's essentially happening is this bone that's the size of a barley is moving because of him, and therefore that would be considered tumah because of the fact that he moved the item based on his strength. And Rashi continues, O Rachav, or the case of the riding, if somebody wants to eat in purity upon a person or animal that is weak, and he rides upon them, so tameh harochiv, that person riding is going to be tameh. Lomi boy nirkav, we don't even need to talk about the person being rode upon. The tameh, he's certainly tameh. Develav hesed avonim nami tameh, because even without moving the stones, a person is tameh. Hamahalich bebeis hapras, if somebody's walking the beis hapras. Ela af harochiv, but even the person riding is tameh, he's also tameh. Dekevan dekach hatachton ra, since the person who's on the bottom is weaker, or since the animal is weak, machmas maso ha'elyon nisatu. So it turns out that the things that are moving because of the weight of the person on top. It's as if he's moving it. And the strength of the person on the bottom is not helping to save him from that tumah. Unless that person is strong. Now, if the person or animal that he's riding upon is strong, so then the weight of the person on top is not really counted. It's not like he's moving the tumah, and therefore in that situation he would not be tameh. And the Gemara continues, Amri Devei Rabbi Yanai, they said in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yanai, L'tfila v'letfilin, for davening and tefillin, Dalet Kavin, we follow a shir of 4 kav, as we'll say in a moment. L'tfila Maihi, what's the case by davening? The Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Hanose Masei al Kseifa, if somebody's carrying a burden on his shoulder, V'higi azman tefila, and the time for davening arrives, Pachas mi Dalet Kavin, so if the load is less than 4 kav, Mafshin lachor, if he could just throw it over his back, Umispalel, and he can daven, since it's light enough, it's not considered to distract his kavanah from davening. Arboa kavan, but if it's 4 kav, meniach al gavi karka, that's already too heavy, so he should put it on the ground and mispalel and then daven. Tefillin mahi, and what's the case by tefillin? The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, hayanose masei al rosho, if a person is carrying a burden on his head, tefillin barosho, and there's also tefillin on his head, imhayu tefillin rotzitzos aser, so if the tefillin are going to be crushed by the load, that's forbidden. Vimla, but if not mutter, it's mutter. Be'eza masei amru, now what kind of burden is considered that it's going to crush the tefillin? Be'masei shel arbas kavan, we're talking about a burden of 4 kav. And the Gemara continues, Tani Rabbi Chia taught, hamotzi zevel al rosho, if somebody's taking out garbage and he's carrying it on his head, with tefillin barosho, and he has his tefillin on his head, hareza lo yisalkim litzdad, and it's not appropriate to move the tefillin to the side. V'lo yiksherim b'masnav, it's also not appropriate to tie it to his loins. Mivneshu noeg bohen minag bizayon, because then he is treating the tefillin in a manner of bizayon, he's disgracing the tefillin. Avol kosher mal zuro b'makom tefillin, but what he could do is he can take the tefillin, even though it's a tefillin shel rosh, he can tie it onto his arm in the place where he puts the arm tefillin. And the Gemara continues, Mishum devei Sheila amru, in the name of the yeshiva of Sheila, they said, afilu mitpachas shelahen, even the scarf in which the tefillin are kept, asur lahaniach al harosh sheyesh bo tefillin, it's forbidden to put that on one's head, to carry it around if on the person's head there is also tefillin. V'kam, and how much is asur, meaning what measurement, what shear is still problematic. Amar Abaya says, afilu riva de pumbedisa, even a quarter of the smallest measure of pumbedisa is going to be problematic. Rashi says, v'kama yehe b'masei, how much does a person have to carry? V'yehe asur lahanicho al harosh, that it's asur to put it on the head. Aliba de Rabbi Sheila, according to Rabbi Sheila, riva de riva, it's a quarter of a quarter, it means revia litra, quarter of a litra, davar mua, to it means to say even a very small amount is forbidden. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots, the Tanakam of the Mishnah said that as long as a field is producing a pile of produce, that is significant enough that the sharecropper has to work it. And then Rabbi Yehuda responded, Amar Rabbi Yehuda said, my kitzvah b'kri, well, what's the fixed amount of a pile? The point is that different fields are going to produce different size piles. Ela im yesh bo kadei nefila, rather it has to be that the field is producing enough, that it is producing enough seeds that it's worth working that field. And the Gemara asks, V'kama kadei nefila, how many seeds does a field have to produce in order for it to be worth it to plant and work that field? Rabbi Ami Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Ami says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Arba soin lakor, it has to produce 4 saw for every field that is a core. Rabbi Ami Dilei Amar, Rabbi Ami himself says, Shemonas soin lakor, it has to produce 8 saw for every land that is a core. And Rashi here explains, Dalit soin zera lakor, 4 saw of seeds for land that is a core. Leves karka core means for land that is the size of a core. What is a core? Vu elef v'chamesh meos ama orech, that would be 1,500 amos in length. Shel nun ama rochav, and it has to be 50 amos wide. Now, how do we know that's the amount? The chatzar hamishkan haves sasayim, because the courtyard of the Mishkan, that was considered to be 2 saw. V'hu meya al nun, and that was 100 by 50. Here we're saying 1,500 by 50. V'kor la mitzayin. Now, a core is 30 saw. So if the chatzar of the Mishkan was 2 saw, and a core is 30 saw, that means it's 15 times the amount. So you multiply 100 by 15, that's how you get your 1,500. That's how Rashi does the calculation. Uvein merubo vein aruch v'katzer. Now it doesn't matter if it's an exact square, or if it's like a rectangle, if cheshben zeh shiuro, that's the amount. So essentially that's a certain amount of land that is a core. It has to produce 4 saw, and again the other opinion was 8 saw. And the Gemara continues, Amar le'ahu savel Rav Chama b'rei de Rabba bar Avua. A certain elder said to Rav Chama, the son of Rabba bar Avua, Asabra loch, I'm going to explain to you that these 2 opinions are not actually arguing. As Rashi explains, Asabra loch lav de Rabbi Ami, poligad Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi. It's not that Rabbi Ami is arguing on his Rabbi Yochanan. Ela sha'olam miskalkel v'holich. What actually happened is that the earth was getting weaker and weaker, and it was producing less and less for the amount of seeds. That's what he means to say. Asabra loch, I'll explain to you. B'shnei de Rabbi Yochanan, in the years of Rabbi Yochanan, have a shmeina ara, the land was very healthy. B'shnei de Rabbi Ami, but in the years of Rabbi Ami, have a kechisha ara, so at that point in time, the land was weaker. And Rashi explains, B'mei Rabbi Yochanan have shmei na'ara. In the days of Rabbi Yochanan, the land was healthier. V'dayu lebeis kor b'dalit sa. And so it was enough. If you had a land that was a base core, you could plant dalit sa, and that would actually be sufficient. It would produce enough. Uv'shnei de Rabbi Ami, but in the years of Rabbi Ami, kvar huchsha, the land already got weaker. Utzricha cheson, you're going to need 8 sa. You're going to need to plant 8 sa of seeds to get the equivalent amount out of the field, and that's why they gave different amounts. And the Gemara continues, Tanan Hasam, we learned over there in the Mishnah in Meseches Peya, Haruach Shapizres Ha'omrin, if the wind scattered the sheaves, so we don't know which is the leket that's supposed to go to the poor, Omdemosa, so we evaluated, Kama leket Ru'uya Lasos, how much leket would generally come from this field, Venosen La'aniyim, and he gives that amount to the poor. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, Nosen La'aniyim Kedei Nefila, he gives to the poor the amount that actually comes, the way Rashi understands, it's the amount of leket, a fixed amount, that actually comes from this size field. The Kama Kedei Nefila, how much is that? Ki Yasser Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Elazar, when Rav Dimi came, he said that Rabbi Elazar said, V'itayim Rabbi Yochanan, and some say that Rabbi Yochanan said, Arba'as Kavin Lakor, it's 4 kav for land the size of a kor. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah asked, Lakor Zera, what do we mean land the size of a kor? Do we mean land that takes seeds that are a core of seeds, or Lakor Tavur? Do we mean land that produces a core of grain? What exactly is that size? And the Gemara continues, according to Rashi, it means to say, if you say that we're talking about land that takes a core of seeds, Lemapolis Yad, is that when you seed it by hand, or Lemapolis Shavarim, or is that when you seed it with oxen? And the Gemara says, Tashma, come in here, the following proof. T'chiyasa Ravin, Amar Rabbi Avua, Amar Rabbi Elazar, because when Ravin came, he said that Rabbi Avua said, that Rabbi Elazar said, V'amri Lam Rabbi Yochanan, and some say that it was Rabbi Yochanan that said, Arboas Kavin Lakor Zera, it's 4 kav for a core when you're seeding it, V'adayin Tiboilach, but it still is a question, Lemapolas Yad, or Lemapolas Shvarim. We don't know if you're putting in the seeds by hand or with oxen, and the Gemara says, take with the Gemara leaves that as a question. And Rashi explains, Haruach Shapizres Ha'omrim, the wind scattered the sheaves besod in the field. V'chisu es haleket shel aniyim hamafuzar besod, it covered up all of the leket of the poor that was scattered throughout the field. Ve'in yadua kama leket hayasham lamata min omrim, we don't know how much leket there was beneath the sheaves. Shamin oso bezin, so bezin does an evaluation. Holchin olev v'shamin, they walk and they evaluate. Kama leket sad zura uya leheasos b'chol shana, how much leket does this field produce every year? And Rashi continues, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, Ein hadavar tzarech omed, you don't need to estimate. Kvar kotzav kedei nefila, there's already a fixed amount. Va'omed v'nosen la'aniyim kedei nipo leket hakotzav, you give to the poor the fixed amount of lekev, again per the size of the field. Ulekamon mefarish lahu, and the Gemara will go on to explain what that exact amount is. It's 4 kav per core. And then the Gemara asks, what do we mean per core? Lakor zera, do we mean the amount of land that takes a core of seeds, which means l'sadash zaru bo core, it means to say a field which you plant a core of seeds. O l'sadash shaloked bo core tvur, do we mean a field that you're going to gather a core of grain? V'im timtza lomar lakor zera, and if you're going to say it's the size of a field that takes a core of seeds, and Rashi continues, lemapolas yad or lemapolas shvarm, are we talking about seeding by hand or with oxen? Yesh makom shazor nasatvua b'yad, there are some places where they seed by hand. V'yesh makom shenosan hazera ba'agola menukavis, in some places they put the seeds in a wagon with a hole, umolichan hashvar masagola la machresha v'hazera hu nofel v'holich, and then as the oxen are pulling the wagon, the seeds fall. V'harbe zera tzarech lemapolas shvarim yoser mimapolas yad, you need much more seed when you're using oxen than when you're doing it by hand. And Rashi continues, v'kami boilon, so that's the question of the Gemara, l'sada shel zera kor lemapolas yad shelo shiarnu beleket shelo arba'as kabin, is it a field that you're using a core of seeds and you're seeding by hand, and there you need 4 kav, that would be a very large field because you're using less seeds in general for the size of the field. O l'kor zera lemapola shvarma, maybe we're talking about a field that takes 1 core of seeds, but you're using oxen, which you use much more seed for less amount of space, and so then it would be a smaller field. And we will note 3 points of interest within Rashi in the sugya. First, Rashi said dalid soy and zera lakor. Rashi interpreted kor as a specific amount of land. He said it's 1500 amos long by 50 amos wide. Generally speaking, when we talk about a base core of land, what we mean to say is that it's land that you put in a core of seeds. You use that much seeds within that land. So Rashi here is interpreting a little different than traditionally understood. Number 2, when the Sugi was talking about leket, it used the term kedei nefila. Now, kedei nefila earlier in the Gemara meant how many seeds you're placing, but by leket, Rashi interpreted that as kedei nipul leket, the amount of leket that would generally fall. Again, a different way of using that term. And finally, the third point, the Gemara mentioned two ways of seeding the land. You can have mapolas yad, which is seeding by hand, or you can have mapolas shvarim, where the oxen pull the wagon and the seeds fall through a hole in the wagon. And the Gemara was talking about using a core of seeds. And Rashi understood that what it means mapolas shvarim is you have to use a lot more seeds in the same amount of land. And there are different ways of understanding exactly what Rashi is getting at. It could be what we're saying is that when you have a core of seeds and you do mapolas yad, so that's a certain amount of land. It's like a large amount of land because you're doing it by hand and you're spacing it properly. When you're doing mapolas shvarim for that same amount of land, you use a lot more seeds. And so it could be the Gemara was saying since you're using a lot more seeds, you're going to have to give more leket. Or it could be the Gemara means the other way around. The Gemara means that if you do a core of seeds, mapolas yad, so then you're gonna space it properly. It's going to grow a lot more, and so there you have to bring more leket than in the case of mapolas shvarim. If you use the exact same amount of seeds, you're not going to be able to spread it in as well of a fashion, and so therefore you're going to give less leket in that case. But again, the idea is the same with either interpretation. The idea is that by mapolas shvarim, you're not using the seeds in the same efficient manner that mapolas yad does. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, HaMakabel Sadam Echaver, if somebody receives a field from his friend, he's acting as a tenant farmer, V'yachla chagav o nishtafa, and locusts consume the crops, or the wind destroys the crops. In Makas Medina, so if it's something that's happening to the entire local area, menachelo min chakoro, so he's allowed to deduct from the amount that he was going to give. Again, by a tenant farmer, he's supposed to give a fixed amount, but in this case, since everybody in the area was affected, he can give less according to how much they were affected. Im eina Makas Medina, however, if it's not a Makas Medina, if it's not a regional disaster, ein menachelo min chakoro, so then he doesn't deduct from the chakiros. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Im kibla menu b'mos. Let's say he said that he's not going to give him a certain amount of produce, but he said he's going to give a certain amount of money. So then bein kach uvein kach, then it doesn't matter what happened, whether it's a Makas Medina or not. Eino menachelo mechakoro, he's not allowed to deduct from that standard amount that he was going to give. And Rashi explains Makas Medina Mefarish B'Gemara. The Gemara will explain what exactly counts as a regional disaster. V'hal lesa ela b'chachronusa. Rashi notes that this Mishnah is talking specifically about a tenant farmer. The ibekavlanusa, because if we're talking about a sharecropper, my menacha ika, there is nothing to deduct. Masha yimsu yachloka, because again they're just dividing whatever is produced. Eino menacha. Then we said again, if it is a Makas Medina, if it's a regional disaster, so then he will deduct. But if it's not a Makas Medina, so then he does not deduct to Amar Lo Mazlucha Garam, because then the owner can tell the tenant farmer that was your bad fortune, and therefore you can't deduct in this case. Again, if it's a regional disaster, he can't say that. And Bein Kach Uvein Kach, then Rabbi Yehuda said that if he was going to give him money and not produce, so then in all situations he needs to give the same amount of money. Afilu hi Makas Medina, even if it is a regional disaster, Eino Menacha, there's still nothing to deduct. Shal Hamos Lo Nigzer Gezerah, there was no Gezerah of the Makas Medina on money, it was on the produce. Hilkach Lo Aleo Haisa Paranazu, therefore the punishment, so to speak, was not on that, and therefore he has to give that same amount of money. And the Gemara says, Hechi Dami Makas Medina, what's considered to be a regional disaster? Amar Rav Yehuda says, Kagon de Ishtof Ruba de Baga, it's if most of the fields within this particular valley were wind blasted. Ula Amar Ula says, Kagon Shenishtadfu Arba Sados, Me Arba Ruchosel. Let's say there are 4 fields surrounding this particular field, and all those 4 fields that surround the field, they're also wind blasted. That's considered to be a regional disaster. Rashi says, Ruva de Baga Rov Habika, meaning most of this valley, Shazu Besocha, which this field is within. Again, 2 opinions on what exactly is a regional disaster. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ula says, Bo b'ma'arava, they asked the following question in the west, Nishtaf telemechad al pnei kula, if one entire row was wind blasted along the whole field, what's the halacha in that case? Rashi explains, Nishtaf telemechad velo yoser misados shehein svivoseh, meaning of the fields that surrounded this field, there was just one row that was wind blasted. V'yoso telem kol svivos sadazu, but that row was completely surrounding this particular field. So is that considered to be a regional disaster in that case? And the Gemara continues, Nishtayir telemechad al pnei kula ma, what if there's one row that remains around the entire thing that was not wind blasted? Rashi says, Nishtayir telemechad kol svivoseh shelo nishtaf, meaning the entire area around, there was just one row totally around that was not wind blasted. V'arba sadosh svivoseh nishtafu, but the 4 fields surrounding it were. V'gamzu nishtaf, and this also was wind blasted. Mahu, what's the halacha there? Mi amrina, do we say, Dekaven de nishtayir telemechad al pnei kula, since one entire entire row remained, shalo lux, and that row was not affected, ein zu makas medina. Maybe we say this is not a makas medina. Ela mazalu is just as bad fortune. Odilmar, maybe hay shiura lav klumhi. The fact that this was left off, that does not mean anything. And the Gemara continues, if Sika Bei Ramai, what if there was a fallow field that was in between this field and the other fields which were wind blasted? Rashi says, Ifsik Beira Sada Bor Hifsik Bein Hashtufos Lazu. There were other fields that were wind blasted, but then there's the Sada Bor, there's this fallow field that's between those fields and this field. And similarly, Aspasta, what if the field between this field and the other fields is Aspasta? It has fodder, which is animal food. Aspasta Hayuosan Shutsavivosa. Again, those were fields of fodder that surrounded Izruah Shachas Lamaichel Behema. They're planted with shachas, which is animal food. V'lo nishtafu, and again, those were not wind blasted. V'hein hifsiku bein hashtufos lazu, and those are in between the ones that were wind blasted. And this one, again, is that considered to be a regional disaster? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Vav Amud Aleph.